Tonight's speaker is David Gibson. And tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the Edmonton Wayfinding Society. David is a co-founder and managing principal of 212 in New York City. His dedication to delivering thoughtful, user-centered design established the firm's reputation as the first advocate of public information design, which is the planning and presentation of complex information to diverse audiences. David leverages the power of design to transform people's experience of public space and information. He leads comprehensive wayfinding programs for leading institutions and organizations such as the Yale University campus and Radio City Music Hall. In addition, the Boston Children's Hospital and LA's acclaimed Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He's led identity design and pedestrian signage systems for the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, and downtown Brooklyn in New York. He has led, among other things, he has led projects for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and the Alexandria Center for Life Sciences in New York Princeton University in New Jersey. That's a long sentence. The Johns Hopkins John Hopkins Hospital in Maryland, and the Sound Transit in Washington. An internationally recognized and published designer, David began his career with the Ontario Ministry of National Resources in Canada. He studied architecture at Cornell University, attended the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and received an MFA in graphic design from Yale. David gives workshops and lectures on the discipline and value of wayfinding design at educational institutions and industry associations across the states and around the world. He is past president and board member of the Society of Experiential Graphic Design and was a member of the National Board of AIGA in the States. David has authored the award-winning volume, The Wayfinding Handbook, which many of you use, many of us refer to in our classes. And he was named Fellow of the SEGD in 2009 and chair of the SEGD's Past President's Council of 2011. Please help me welcoming David.
Thank you so much. I hope that wasn't too tedious, all these things. So I'm really excited to be here. The last time I was in Edmonton, actually I forgot to check the actual year. It was maybe 1974 for the Eco-Grata Congress. I was studying in Halifax and I drove across the country with a friend and we stopped in Winnipeg, slept in a waterbed. The one and only time I ever slept in a waterbed was in Winnipeg, and I'm not sure why it was. And we came to Edmonton and participated in Eco-Grata, and I since became involved in Eco-Grata, and I think we have other Eco-Grata stalwarts here. So I had this business in New York City, and I've been involved in wayfinding for a long time, and I've done a lot of projects and developed some ideas about how wayfinding works. This talk is a little different. It's not so much about the work I've done, but the way that I think about wayfinding, and I want to sort of tell some stories. I've sort of become a bit of a storyteller as I get deeper into my career. And this year I've been writing, there's a book that's going to be coming out, I don't know, in the next year or so, called 12 on Type by a Canadian publisher in Ottawa. And I've been looking at the way that I've been using typography in my career, which has been sort of an interesting lens. It's called My Life in 10 Types. So I'm sort of using the different typefaces I used over my career. But this is a talk that's kind of interweaving a little bit about who I am and some interesting women in my family and the way that I think about traveling and journeys and how we get information. So let us get started. So there we go. So, lost and found. Now, is this dark enough? Do you can see okay? Does it get like super dark if we turn these out?
We can.
Should we try it? Let's just see. You're all going to fall asleep. That's me. Right. Yeah, that's better.
Is that better?
Yeah, I can see this. Lost and found. The art of getting lost and the science of finding your way. It was 5 o'clock on a warm May day. Clear Canadian light flickered in the poplar trees. their green-gray leaves fluttering in the gentle afternoon breeze. Sculptural trunks of the staghorn sumacs were casting crazy dark shadows on the ground my dad was clearing for his perennial borders. This place was our new summer cottage, which was still under construction in Georgeville, Quebec. It was the spring of 1953, and I was 2.5 years old. My mother and I had just returned from an old spring where she got fresh water for cooking at our cottage, which didn't yet have running water. Mom took the water jugs into her still unfinished kitchen, leaving me outside to play. My brother was in another part of the house, absorbed in a book. With dinner underway, my mom took a break and came outside to check on me. That's when the drama began. Mom called out to Dad, "Douglas, is Dave with you?" He replied, "No, Barb, I thought he was with you." A lovely late spring afternoon, a day full of promise for warm, playful summer ahead, turned into a scene of cold panic. It quickly dawned on my parents that I was lost. Terror-struck, they searched the house and property, but there was no sign of me. With no phone yet installed, my older brother was dispatched to the village to spread word that I was missing. My mother recalls imagining the article in the Montreal Gazette about the negligent family that had lost their youngest child in the country. An hour or so after I was lost, a passing couple found me, a young child in green corduroy overalls with blue sneakers, climbing the low stone wall of the village graveyard. What was I doing? Where did I go? I had merrily followed a family of basset hounds, big, friendly, floppy-eared lumbering dogs, on their usual path along the old logging road, past the sugar shack on an ancient trail through the maple forest. In the end, the only things that were lost that day were one of my blue sneakers and the innocence of my young post-war parents. It seems that taking journeys is a bit of a family tradition. In 1849, my step-great-great-great-grandfather, Tobias Gilmore Mealy, took a biggie when he went to seek his fortune in the California gold rush. In a trip that took 175 days, he sailed on the brig Amelia from Eastport, Maine, though in fact he was from New Brunswick, around the tip of South America to San Francisco. He's quite an interesting guy, but it's the journeys of 4 remarkable women in my family that I want to tell you about. Anne Hutchinson, Esther Wheelwright, Laura Secord, that Laura Secord, and Clara Barton. These are women of great courage who made extraordinary journeys. Esther was taken from her home against her will. Anne, Laura, and Clara were moved by circumstances to travel and set off in sometimes difficult conditions with not much to guide them. So let's go on a romp through North American history to see how these women found their way. Anne Hutchinson was a female religious activist and a big troublemaker in 17th century colonial Boston, where she'd settled in 1634 to escape the English attacks on nonconformists like herself. She was a Puritan spiritual advisor who believed that salvation came from the nature of your belief in God, not from what you did in life. In his new book, Fantasyland, author and design journalist Kurt Anderson has described how deeply she held to her religious beliefs, even in the face of scorn and disapproval from the religious establishment. She was a nonconformist among nonconformists, and this ideology threatened the established clergy in Massachusetts. In 1638, she and many of her followers were tried, convicted, and banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The refugees established the settlement of Portsmouth in what is now Rhode Island. Ongoing threats from Massachusetts compelled Anne to head further away to New Amsterdam, which is what we now know as New York. She moved to what is now the Bronx in an area crossed by her namesake parkway. So there you see the Hutchinson River Parkway, so anybody in New York knows what we call the Hutch. During a raid in August of 1643, Hutchinson and most of her children and household members were massacred by First Nations people. Hutchinson must have been an ambitious, outspoken, restless woman, unafraid to speak her mind and face the consequences. The result of her fiery temperament was usually a journey, first across the North Atlantic at a time when that was not an easy passage. When Boston rejected her, she set off in search of places where she could live and worship freely. She must have been an incredible optimist, believing that her travels would always take her to a better place. Hutchinson is a key figure in the development of religious life in England's American colonies and in the history of women in ministry. Though her journey ended in death, she was relentless in her travels, always pushing further to a place where she could practice her beliefs without the constraints imposed by the male elite. The monument to her by the Massachusetts State House calls her a courageous exponent of civil liberty and religious toleration. Kurt Anderson thinks of her as one of his prototypical Fantasyland American crazies. She was really intense about her beliefs. Esther Wheelwright was born in Wells, Maine in 1696, part of a strict Puritan establishment, a strict Puritan settlement established by her great-grandfather, who was the brother-in-law of Van Hutchinson. At age 7, Wheelwright was captured during an attack on her village by a group of Wabanaki Indians who were allied with the French. She was placed with a native family and quickly adopted the clothes and customs of the Wabanaki, a Catholic First Nations people whose population had been decimated by smallpox. She was later brought to Quebec City, where she was scrubbed of her native garb and customs and joined the aristocratic household of the governor of New France. Finally, she was placed in the school of the Ursuline Sisters in Quebec, and she remained there for the rest of her life and eventually became Mother Superior of the order. Like Hutchinson, Wheelwright's journey was conducted in stages. First, she was removed from her birthplace, led by native people who knew the forest and the way through it. Then, as a pawn in the colonial struggles between English and French, she was taken by French troops to what would become her home for the rest of her life. Esther's journey was one she didn't plan. She was lost to her family, alone in a place she didn't know or understand. She quickly adapted, and when given a chance to return home, she refused. It's sort of amazing to think that she didn't want to go home. In the process, she found her calling. She's notable for early on having lived in 3 of the major North American cultures: English, First Nations, and French. This gave her a unique perspective as a religious leader during the transfer of power from France to England at the end of the 7 Years' War. Laura Secord started her life in Connecticut in 1775 on the cusp of the American Revolution. A generous offer of land drew her family north to Upper Canada after the Revolution ended. By the beginning of the War of 1812, she lived in Queenston, not far from Niagara Falls, in an area that was an active battleground during the war fought between the newly independent United States of America and Great Britain. The Secord's house had been commandeered as a billet for American troops who then occupied the territory. One day, Secord overheard some American soldiers talking about plans for an impending attack on the British. On the night of June 22nd, 1813, Secord left her wounded husband and 5 young children at home and walked for 2 days through the woods to tell British Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon about the impending American attack. Her information was vital and helped the British repel the American advance in the victorious Battle of Beaver Dams. Hers was a secret, dangerous journey, taken across terrains you probably knew well. It took courage and a sense of purpose to make that trek through the woods. For her troubles in 1913, Laura Secord became the namesake of Canada's famed National Candy Company. Those 2 days in the woods were just a blip in her long life, but in some ways proved to be the making of her. That journey defined her for the history books. Clara Barton was an acclaimed, self-taught nurse who provided care to wounded soldiers during the Civil War. That's right there. This followed her earlier work as a teacher and as a patent clerk. In both her war work and her patent office efforts, she faced the condemnation and scorn of male superiors who didn't think it suitable for women to be so engaged outside the home. Over the course of the Civil War, she became more and more active in the gathering of medical supplies and the provision of medical care to wounded soldiers. This led to her involvement with the women's and civil rights movements, and she worked in conjunction with Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. Her fame and her extensive lecture tours about her war work proved exhausting, and doctors prescribed a rest cure abroad. In 1869, while on that European trip, she went to Geneva, where she met one of the early Red Cross leaders, Dr. Louis Appia. He invited her to form the American branch of that organization, which she did in 1881. Clara Barton's journey was a holiday rest cure, but being the energetic woman she was, this became a journey that sowed the seeds of one of the country's most beloved public health care institutions. She set off with one purpose in mind, but by the end, a very different outcome ensued. The roots of my work as a professional wayfinder can be found in the journeys of my family members and in my own childhood pursuits. That was my early love of bright colors. As a kid, I was obsessed with collecting foreign stamps. I played travel games. Pirate and Traveler was an amazing, I think the reason I travel is because I played that game. And made countless visits to Montreal's hometown Expo 67. At school, I was an avid student of Canadian history and loved the stories of European explorers like Alexander Mackenzie and Robert de La Salle, who crossed the North American continent in search of the favored Northwest Passage. My mind and spirit were open to the idea of people and places to be shaped and explored, and people who needed help on their journeys. Our lives today are filled with countless journeys. As a designer, I now realize that each new wayfinding experience is a kind of voyage of discovery through places unknown. It's very curious that this picture I've used for quite a while has Edmonton on it. According to James Ackerman, co-author of the fascinating book Maps, Finding Our Place in the World, people invariably ask themselves 3 questions before they begin wayfinding. Where am I? Where am I going? And how do I get there? I would add a 4th equally important question: why am I going there? Imagine a person who might be on an important business trip to a distant city. If it's a foreign country, like Germany and Frankfurt, the language, culture, food, currency, transit, and geography of that place are likely quite unfamiliar. Or think of a person going to a large local hospital to visit a child who's seriously ill. Because the medical center might be overwhelming and the human drama rather painful, navigation there can be a difficult, scary experience. Both foreign travel and a hospital visit can be daunting journeys filled with both anticipation and anxiety, full of wrong turns and miscues before the destination is reached. Rather like the journeys of European explorers crossing an unknown continent, or Van Hutchinson in search of a place of religious freedom. Let's remember that there are other kinds of journeys too. Think of a museum visit on a rainy Sunday afternoon. It's a chance to spend the afternoon absorbing the collection, learning something new, making discoveries. Though there might be a specific destination in mind, it is more likely a chance to get lost in the riches of the experience. A weekend trip to wine country might be a similar kind of trip in search of new options, new tastes, new ideas about food and drink. It seems like wonderful accidental discoveries can be made when it appears we are lost. Think back to Esther Wheelwright, who found herself when she seemed to be most lost. Most of the traveling we do is for a defined purpose, with a predictable beginning and end point. But as I've said, that's not always the case. Writer Matt Gross has talked about an intriguing way of traveling. For a while, he authored the New York Times travel features called Getting Lost in Tangier, Lost in Ireland, and so on. His premise is one that strikes terror in the heart of this wayfinding designer. He decided to forego the usual directional tools and travel raw, unaided, unencumbered by maps, GPS, guidebooks, and so on. He had no expectations and made no hotel reservations. He said, "Instead of devising my own itinerary, I will let the place itself guide me." How many times have I shuddered when I've heard an architect say, "This facility doesn't need signs. The building speaks for itself." I know many of you who have worked in the profession have been there. Literature offers a clue to the phenomenon of getting lost. In A Room with a View, E.M. Forster describes the late 19th century Florentine journey of Lucy Honeychurch and her maiden aunt Charlotte Bartlett, rendered so vividly by Helena Bonham Carter and Maggie Smith in the 1985 film. Like other English tourists of the day, they relied on their Baedeker travel guide to navigate the unfamiliar landscape of continental cities. As the novel unfolds, the two women wander the streets of Florence without their Baedeker. Charlotte, entranced by the purple prose of author Eleanor Lavish, seems on the verge of casting off the constraints of upper middle class Victorian life, while Lucy loses her innocence on a Florentine piazza and falls hard for the real charms of the dreamy and eccentric young George Emerson. The two women drink in the danger and romance of Florence, and the adventures begin. In the end, Lucy flees her engagement to the stiff, uncompromising prig to marry the unpromising Mr. Emerson. The result is romance, passion, and A Room with a View. You just never know what might happen on a European vacation. For Clara Barton, the exhausted traveler, far from being merely a rest cure, it in fact launched the most significant project of her lifetime. Successful wayfinding inevitably depends on reaching the goal, literally and figuratively. An intense sense of purpose drove Laura Secord through the woods in 1813, and likewise the Canadian explorers. They were quintessential wayfinders, willing to cross through enemy territory, an ocean, or a continent to succeed in their quest. In their zeal to colonize the New World and find the Northwest Passage, the explorers relied upon a host of navigational aids. The constellations served as landmarks, the inland lakes and rivers as connectors, with native people as guides for long journeys into the unknown. This is how they navigated and traveled when there were no maps. Over several centuries, the geographic information about North America grew more detailed. The maps filled in and became clearer, serving as better and better guides to travelers' journeys. But even by the 19th century, successful exploration inevitably relied not only on a detailed map, but also a compass and a good sense of direction. This evolution of navigation tools has sped up in the digital age, to our great convenience, but also at a loss. Now Google and GPS have taken mapping to a level of micro detail. Here we can navigate on the Hutchinson River Parkway. All the information we need is right there in our smartphone. Some years ago, Stephen Krug wrote Don't Make Me Think, a seminal book on web usability. His basic premise is that websites should be intuitive, allowing people to smoothly navigate digital information. He said that the search for navigation and other cues should be effortless for the largest number of web users. When Krug wrote his book, the web was still developing. Users were learning the paradigm, and developers were learning how to create user-friendly interfaces. The GPS paradigm is the ultimate don't make me think digital interface, and therein lies the problem. True engagement with the wayfinding process is lost in the face of all those alerts telling us what to do. GPS users are not explorers, they are rote followers of instructions. You've seen those GPS travelers hesitating as they walk the streets, nervously looking up for landmarks in the streetscape, and then down at their screens for reassurance about the route. When you use GPS in your car, you don't need to understand context, landmarks, geography, or the cardinal points of the compass. You don't think, you just follow directions. Turn left, turn right, keep going straight ahead, or make one of those legal U-turns, the not so subtle signal that a mistake has been made. A journey made entirely by following the GPS leaves me cold. In the process, I don't have to think, and as a result, I haven't learned much about the route or built up a store of knowledge for next time. I have no meaningful picture of where I've been or where I'm going. That bugs me because I'm a wayfinding designer whose job it is to empower people with their travels. What if, when I programmed the GPS, I entered the wrong Springfield? God knows where I might end up. In the United States, there's a Springfield in virtually every state. So, is there? I was trying to figure out
That's
this.
why the Simpsons are from Springfield.
They are indeed, exactly. And we don't really know what state they're in, do we? New York Times reporter Janaya Belafonte wrote about this very problem recently in a story about New York City's transportation troubles that she called, "Does Anybody Know Where We're Going?" She provides a humorous anecdote about an anticipated 11-minute Uber trip from one destination in Brooklyn to downtown Brooklyn. The driver, following the GPS instructions on the Uber app, took her instead to Manhattan, to Lower Manhattan, 2 miles from her intended destination. Way out of the way. She stated, "The driver tried to cancel the trip so I would not be charged, but her effort failed, and I lacked the time to deal with the onerous process of complaining to Uber, the surest path to job-threatening bouts of daytime drinking." She further tells the story of a colleague whose taxi driver required GPS to get him the 12 blocks from 9th Avenue and 29th Street to 6th Avenue and 20th Street. I rest my case. I am an expert, a professional. You might even call me a scientist. When I'm designing a wayfinding program, I worry that people will get lost, that they won't be able to find their way. I suppose you could say that my career as a navigation expert began that spring day at our unfinished cottage. Perhaps there was a darker element to my childhood stroll in the forest. Was there a moment of terror at being lost and separated from my family? Was that fear imprinted on my brain, and has my work as a graphic designer been an attempt to ensure that everyday people will not find themselves lost as I was back in 1953? These days, with Lucy Honeychurch in mind, I have to remind myself that getting lost is as important as finding the way. So I think we have a great responsibility to those we are assisting on their journeys. We need to empower them to find their destinations, but not be afraid of letting them get lost along the way. Over the years, I've learned a few things about the wayfinding design process. In the end, I think it's important to keep 3 essential principles in mind. First, I'd say we always have to think about the people and the place. In other words, what's the context, who are the people, and why are they making the journey? The next is to devise a simple picture of what might be a complex place. This mental mapping strategy will create a foundation for the wayfinding experience. With this, we can guide people and also empower them to stray from that path and not find themselves totally lost along the journey. Finally, with all the resources we now have at our fingertips, it's incumbent on us to build robust wayfinding toolkits that will give people the information when and where they need it, in a form that best suits them. I guess what I'm saying is that when the science of wayfinding is well executed, the art of getting lost becomes possible.